Well, in the last few weeks, we've been covering here at the Aussie Wire some of what's happening back in the motherland, back in the United Kingdom, and there's some crazy stuff going on. I wanted to touch base with someone on the issue of academic freedom, and in particular, universities. We know that here in Australia, the experiences of people like Dr. Peter Ridd would cast doubt on the idea that there is academic freedom. We watch what's happening in the US, where massive student protests take place when a speaker is invited to speak. So much for universities being the home of ideas and the battle of ideas. That those days seem to be long gone. But are they suffering the same problems in the United Kingdom, the home of freedom, at least as it relates to Australia in the modern era? Well, to find out, I've invited on Ella Nixon. Ella, thank you so much for joining us here at the Aussie Wire.
Hello, thank you for having me.
It used to be taken for granted that universities were the place, even if nowhere else would, they were the place where robust conversations were had, disagreements were had, great minds could thrash out ideas and uncover the truth via whatever means necessary almost. They could sometimes be very brutal debates that would go on in universities. It seems that the same disease that has infected Australian and US universities may have infected universities in the UK as well. What is it actually like over there? What is the academic situation over there?
I think the tide has been turning a lot more in recent times. So there was a period where I'd say freedom of speech was especially restricted with what speakers were invited and lots of protests going on.
Mm,
But now there's been quite a bit of pushback. So there's been societies that have been funded by the Free Speech Union through a fund called the McTaggart Fund,
hmm
and they've been established and they're hosting speakers from, a wide political spectrum, not just people who are just on the would be classed as right wing or left wing, but all over the spectrum,
mm.
political spectrum, to push back against what kind of speakers can be hosted at universities and kind of cultivate this environment of free speech.
Mm. Well, this is an article here that is an example of one of those activist protests that you mentioned there. This was a gender critical speaker. I think the fashionable term these days is a trans exclusionary radical feminist. They seem to, I don't know, new words get made up all the time. I'm still not quite sure what that one means. But it just seems as though we've entered an age, and I'm encouraged to hear that maybe the UK is coming out of it. I'll explore that more in a moment. But we're either in or we've just passed through an age of remarkable intolerance in what we're allowed to say. And I find it really curious that free speech has been framed as a right wing idea, as a right wing ideal. Historically, the left wing have been very committed to the idea of free speech, freedom of expression. I can say what I want, man. Let me live my life. What happened? What changed there?
I think free speech is always the tool of the minority for the people whose opinion, are kind of are thought to be morally bad. So I think at the moment people on the left wing have more of a moral case for their free speech. It's in the culture of care. Words can incite hatred. So I think at the moment people who are maybe more conservative get branded with this kind of moral blight, and that's why their freedom of speech is being belittled.
Mm. So you mentioned to me as we were chatting before we began recording that actually there's been some legislation passed in the UK. Tell me a little bit about what that legislation actually is designed to do.
So the freedom of speech clause for the universities is just designed to protect the right of universities to host different speakers so they can't be cancelled based on their political views. And this was especially brought to light with the platforming of Jordan Peterson
Mm.
at Cambridge after he was cancelled from his speeches at the I think it was at the Union. And then he was re-invited back as a speaker who, okay, some people didn't agree with what he said, but that didn't matter because it's a university and a university should host speakers of all opinions.
Mm. It's quite an extraordinary thing. I mean, Jordan Peterson to me doesn't seem like all that radical of a thinker or a speaker. He just speaks fairly plainly and states what, in many cases, are very, very obvious truths. We've come to a stage where people are incredibly sensitive. And you mentioned a moment ago this idea that words are violence. This is quite a novel concept. Now, personally, I've never been punched in the pronoun, but it seems like some people feel like the words are literal violence. How do we come back from this sensitivity to try and recultivate a culture where we can have heavy conversations and not always be taking it personally?
I think we need to learn by example because it's very easy to complain, but we need to start to create the content which shifts the conversation.
Mm.
And for people who accuse free speech of saying it's only for like an extreme right wing position, we need to actually prove, it's for people of all different persuasions,
Mm.
and to just change those stereotypes.
You mentioned the legislation that guaranteed a certain amount of freedom for universities and what they did. Here in Australia, we're fighting for the second time in 10 years. We defeated it 10 years ago and it's come back in a different form. A bill that is trying to create a power for the government to use social media companies to punish people who say things that they don't like. And in particular, the government is threatening to punish social media companies if they leave content on their platform that breaches certain rules. What does it say about where we're at that the government is now looking to private companies and social media companies especially to try and bring about some sort of restrictions on free speech?
This especially worries me because social media companies are so large that they cannot be completely run by humans. To censor speech is such a big task, so that they're having to rely on algorithms. So
Mm,
actually, our freedom of speech is not just being censored by individuals who might have a personal problem with us,
sure.
but actually by large digital corporations. And what does that say about the power of the individual human in society?
I beg your pardon. Sorry about that. No, this is a great point, and we're up against it in that regard. But I'm very, very encouraged to hear that actually the United Kingdom has had the good sense to protect universities, and hopefully some of that common sense will start to spread. Well, Ella, you and I are both are committed to this, creating the new content that you talked about there, where we start to cross this bridge and start to have everyone simultaneously accept that free speech is vital to our progress. I commend your good work, and thank you so much for coming on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you for having me.